Government executive.
Government executive.
Government executive.
Government executive. Government executive.
Government executive.
Government executive.
Up Close, Conversations with Federal Leaders is underwritten by Tableau.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're excited to have you here with us for this installment of Up Close, Conversations with Federal Leaders. I'm Aaron Boyd, Senior Editor of Technology and Events at NextGov. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our series underwriter Tableau for helping spotlight these important discussions. Today, I'm excited to introduce Maria Roat, Deputy Federal Chief Information Officer. Maria, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate it.
Of course. So just to get us started here, wanted to get an idea of who you are, where you come from. I know you've been in the federal space for a little bit now. How did you get started in working on government IT projects?
I've been in government IT, working for the federal government more or less for since I joined the Navy. Actually, Aaron, in 1981 was when I worked on my first computer. So I have been in this. Always in IT, always in federal IT, whether it was Department of Defense or the civilian agencies. I did have a little break in service for about 5 years. I went out to the private sector and then came back to government. But I've been in tech this whole time, and I absolutely love it. And I like the change, and I like learning about the new technologies and all of that. You know, I came out of, I like math, and I like, coming out of that, I was kind of a math geek, way back, and that's how I got into computers and learning about it. So, working in operations and engineering, and then just kind of moved up the ladder, the career ladder, if you will. So I did start as a GS3.
Wow! And what are you at now? Are you above a 15, or where are you on the?
Yeah, no, I'm certainly an SES now.
Oh, right, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, when I got off active duty, I was. When I joined the federal service after I got off the Navy, I started as a GS3. So
fantastic.
Yeah,
was IT always the plan, or is it something you just kind of fell into as a nerd?
I think a little bit of both. My interest was piqued while I was in high school. They had, how they have vocational tech ed stuff in high school? Yeah. Well, where I grew up in upstate New York, they happen to have a computer class. And I learned how to program on a little Burroughs on a key punch and using punch cards, and I was hooked.
It's funny. I
joined the Navy.
Yeah, I had basically the same thing, except it was for building physical computers versus the coding side of things. But that's what got me into all this too. So yeah.
Yep. And I'm not a good coder. I will tell you that I am not good at that.
Helps to understand it, I imagine, though.
It does. I can troubleshoot, but I just don't have the patience to sit and write.
Yeah. So where are you now? Like, so everybody knows you're the deputy federal CIO, but past the Navy, your work with at multiple federal agencies, and now you're kind of at the top looking down across all of this. Can you talk to us a bit about that trajectory, how you got there, and how the view differs from the top looking down at all the other agencies, being able to see everything all at once instead of just the shop you work at?
It's very different. I'm not sure how I got here. I'll tell you, working here at OMB, I've been here since May. I've always been operational my whole career. Always been operational, had my hands in it, even as a CIO, right? You're driving change at the agency, working with the agency mission. Now up here at OMB, it's more policy related, and things move a little bit slower, and I'm not real good at that. So I'm having to learn, the pace of policy and understand who gets to weigh in and all of that, and understanding, how the sausage is made around policy, if you will. But also bringing with me all that experience to say, if you do that, here's what's going to happen at the agency level, right? A CIO is going to scream, or somebody's going to holler, or this is just not going to work. So I think it helps that I'm bringing that perspective to the role, having been at not just one agency, but multiple agencies in the federal government as well as DOD, and having that, I think that helps. Because as I'm looking at things now, and modernization and transformation and, CX and the customer and all of these things, I get it. And I understand what it means to create a journey map, right? And I understand what it means to be operational. So being able to use that as we develop policy or update policy or get rid of policy.
Yeah. How often in a day do you look at something and go, as a former agency CIO, I know nobody's going to be able to implement this or nobody's going to want to implement this. And how often is it kind of the other way around where you're looking at it and you're going, as a former, and now that I'm in my OMB seat, I know that they don't want to do this, but we really need to force it down. Like, how often is the trade-off back and forth?
So there is some of that. I'll tell you, I had a whiteboard session. It's the second one with my team. We're working on something, and so now that I'm here at OMB, that there's something I'm focused on that I said, you know what, we need to fix this. This is not working. It never worked for me as a CIO. It doesn't work for the other CIOs. So having that brainstorming session with the team here and saying, thinking differently, right? Thinking outside the box, all those pithy, sayings, but really trying to get to what are the core requirements? This is what we have to do by law. They tell you what, but they don't tell you how to do it. And we've been doing the how for a long time and it doesn't work for anybody. So how do we rethink this thing? And so I've had a couple of whiteboard sessions with my staff and getting them to understand that it's okay to put ideas on the table. I'm a big whiteboarder and bring people to the table and throw all the ideas out there and, and then you start formulating something. So we've been doing a little bit of that over the last couple of weeks. And so it's going to be interesting to see what shakes out of this because I'm really pushing on, because I know as bringing that perspective from the agency that this thing just does not work. Great. So now I'm in a position where I can fix that thing or make it go away or make it better. So I'm not going to tell you what it is, but
I was going to ask. I was hoping you were. But yeah, that was the point I was getting at. It's one thing to be able to say this isn't going to work. It's another thing to be in the position you're in now, where things as they are aren't going to work. You still have to find a solution, right? You have to get to an answer. Right.
So
I wanted to sift to some of the specific issues going on right now. I think the biggest one that we can all agree on would be the coronavirus, the pandemic. I'd argue it might be the biggest government-wide IT challenge ever. What do you think on that?
It's really interesting because the CIOs over the last few years, shout out to all of them and the CIO Council because they've been setting the stage. People have been teleworking, while not to the extent this year, but the flip over to telework was actually pretty seamless. And, the credit to the CIOs and the CIO Council that made that happen. And, the CIOs were able to really focus on, the CARES Act, the implementation, the requirements that were coming down every day. And, oh, by the way, we're adding 3,000 people and we've got to rethink our mission because we don't have those, storefronts across the country, right? We don't have those anymore. There's no more physical. How do we turn to the digital? So even as the federal employees flipped over to telework, there was this whole other mission space, responding to the CARES Act and responding to the agency mission where you didn't have brick and mortar and you had to rethink how you would meet the public digitally because people just couldn't go to your, building, your storefront, if you will. So a shout out to the CIOs. And I think they did a really phenomenal job. And a lot of them worked really, really hard. The collaboration amongst the CIOs and the CIO Council, it was amazing. It was remarkable. And it really showed how fast we could move and get bureaucracy out of the way, get the cumbersome procedures out of the way, and just execute and make things happen. I know as a CIO early this year, there were things I had planned later on this year in 2020 and into 2021 that I was able to move. I said, oh, I got an opportunity. We need this. And I moved it to the left. And I wasn't the only CIO that did that. They took advantage of that. And this is really where the CIOs and their leadership really, really came out and how they executed and were able to move very quickly. But I think, we need to continue to be resilient as we're moving forward because who'd have thought we would have still been in this environment and having to rethink what digital really means for the federal government.
Yeah. You had a couple interesting things there, a couple I want to dig into. So one of them was you mentioned that it was pretty seamless. That a lot of people were able to just move along in IT and in government, and especially when you put those together. everything is never always seamless, right? There's always going to be some hiccups and some bumps. So without necessarily naming names of agencies, we don't want to name and shame anybody for trying to do the good work. But what were some of those issues that you saw arising consistently that you were able to help with in your perch at OMB, right? Versus being on there on the ground and being able to stick your fingers in it and physically fix it. From OMB, what were you able to do to help some of these agencies that might have been struggling?
Yeah, so one of the things with the CIO Council, so Suzette, while she was here, that memorandum that went out and just got a bunch of the barriers out of the way for the CIOs, right? And so, that was one of the things, because the CIO Council, we were meeting every day. We had calls every day. And Suzette was leading those. A lot of credit to her for doing that. But she took the input from the agencies where they were having pain points, turned that around into an memo, and that turned that into guidance to say, make these things happen. So when you pull that memo, you'll see out of that those were some areas where the CIOs were having some issues. I think across the federal government, we identified certainly some areas where we need to do better. Data sharing across the federal government, the cross collaboration I mentioned a minute ago, and even where we need to move faster, especially around data maturity, some of the collaboration across the federal government, and really accelerate. So if we were able to do all of this earlier this year and move that fast, how do we do that in the future? So that's been a lot of the discussion and some of what's been surfaced up. It's not I think turning your question around, what didn't work? How do we make it better? And that's really what the CIOs are focused on. Okay, we did X, but now we need to do Y and Z and keep things moving to really address some of those gaps that we identified. Mm-hmm. Cybersecurity continued to be front and center. We did have, challenges with social media, impersonations, right? Yeah. Where people were impersonating agency heads and others. And the cybersecurity folks were, really had to stay on top of that, as well as the attacks on the federal government. Because a lot of, adversaries and whoever might be said, hey, the federal government went to telework. Guess what? Let's see what we can do. But, again, shout out to the council and the CIOs for having the resiliency built into a lot of what they're doing and moving into, zero trust network frameworks and some of that. So, but I think, in the long run, continuing to drive and keep that momentum, I think is going to be a challenge, and getting that bureaucracy out of the way and continuing to do that.
Mm-hmm. But I did like what you said before about this, being forced into some of these digital services. Hopefully we can move those forward in the future for citizen services. Another thing we're seeing a lot of is people really enjoying teleworking, right? It's not for everyone, obviously, but we're seeing a lot of like IG reports and GAO reports that are surveying the federal workforce, and they seem to want more telework options once all this is over. Do you foresee OMB coming out with some new telework policies?
I don't know about that. I think, OPM certainly has a role in that. And I think looking broadly across the federal government, I think physical space is something that should be looked at, right? How do we as a government, if we're in this, changed environment where we don't have the entire workforce coming to an office every day, maybe it's half the workforce, maybe it's a quarter, I think, with GSA, real estate is something that they'll be looking at hard to say, what do we really need? And what's that shift over the next few years for the federal government, right? So even as the CIOs have got the technology, we're putting things in place, right? Digital transformation, serving the public, we got all this going on. There's the infrastructure behind it, not just the networks, but the physical, right? The buildings and those kind of things, and rethinking how we serve up our services, because in the physical, you still need those buildings, right? There's people that are still going to go to the buildings, right? My mom, as digital as she is, we've had her on email and cell phones and all smartphones, right? So she is on it and she's really good. But there is things that she does that she wants to go to a place. And I think that's going to be hybrid, really going to be more of a hybrid. Maybe you make an appointment online, and maybe when you go into the building, you check in, at a kiosk, or check in from your smartphone from an app. Then you go meet with somebody. So I think the whole dynamic's going to change in how we interface with the public, even when you need that face-to-face interaction.
Yeah, bringing that forward as well. I imagine that agencies are probably collecting a whole lot of customer experience data that they didn't have before, right? If everything's more digital, there's more data coming in. What advice do you have to your colleagues and peers down the line who at these agencies who might be getting all this new data and aren't necessarily sure what to do with it or what they should be looking for, all this stuff? What new data do you see coming in? And again, what advice do you have for how that should be treated?
Yeah, that's a great question, Aaron, because when you rethink the models, right? I think using that data and how people interact with an agency, right? What are those touch points? And can you use technology to answer questions, right? We do this all the time. We're through chatbots and things like that, and where there's knowledge bases already. And even at SBA, where we were taking emails coming in and turning those into cases and deduplicating the massive amount of emails and messages that were coming in. And I think taking that data and rebuilding what that model looks like for an agency, and how they interact with the public. I think that's how the data is going to be used, right? So even if you were getting, 20,000 emails a day through the start of the pandemic, or 30,000, or all these phone calls, rethinking your business model, I think there's an opportunity there, in how you're interacting with the public rather than, the in-person interaction. So I think that data will serve up, different models.
Excellent. One more on this. I want to talk a bit about something else you mentioned earlier, which was accelerating some of these digitization, modernization moves that were already happening, like you mentioned at SBA while you were still there. We've heard a lot of people saying that COVID is good for the cloud, right? It incentivizes moving to the cloud and all that stuff. From your place at OMB, how much new cloud migrations, new cloud services are you seeing seeing accelerate because of COVID?
Yeah. So, agencies, they were, like I said before, they were already deploying, right, all of these capabilities. And so they were able to rapidly implement a lot of response actions. But again, you saw them take that core capabilities they had and just build on it, right? Instead of buying hardware, moving to SaaS solutions, software as a service, and building on their existing, technologies or cloud footprints. That's what we saw was just that build out, building on what was already in place. And I think that's where you saw the flexibility and, might I say, nimble, right? Being flexible and using what you have and then just building up, being able to scale in the cloud, right? Some of the websites, SBA, of course, and then, the VA and HHS and others that saw even their websites, very simply, the external portals just get hit with just sheer volumes of traffic. Yet you saw the cloud scale up. They were able to absorb it and then, and scale it right back down when when the traffic died back down again. So I think, having the capabilities already deployed and taking advantage of it really made a difference. There's still some challenges, of course, with, some of our older technologies where we needed to scale up on the front end, but we still had to interface with some of the older technologies on the back end. But, and I think, that really put a spotlight on, well, here's some areas where we need to continue to focus.
Excellent. One last topic I wanted to hit on. It's the other big one of the day, which is the impending change for all federal employees, right? We're coming into the new year. We're coming out of an election year. So you've been through this before. You've been in the federal government for some time. What advice do you have for the IT folks and the policy folks about making sure the things you're working on endure into the next year?
In the technology space, I have seen over time, from administration to administration, that everybody builds on it, right? So technology is really bipartisan. And if you look back over time, and you've been doing this a while, Aaron, and you see how everybody builds on what their predecessors have done. So regardless of, your party or what, everybody's building on that. And I think that's what makes technology really good. And you've seen that over time with the CIOs, federal CIOs coming in, the agency CIOs, and everybody's trying to make it better and continue to build on their predecessors, right? It may not be the exact same way, but it's going to build and it's going to move the federal government forward even faster, and to be even more, digital.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that the tech policy priorities should be going into next year? What would you like to see, either new policies come out or updates, or what focus do you think there should be?
We have to continue our sustained, modernization. Modernization is not a one and done. We have to figure out how we're going to continue to sustain. I mentioned sustaining that momentum, right? But that continuous modernization of our systems and our programs, and continuing, to keep those updated. And it's not a one and done. If you look at the TMF, that enabled multi-year funding, and we're seeing success out of that on the projects with the TMF, right? They're feeding 2 and 3 year projects that otherwise wouldn't get funded with single year money. And that's really important that we have that sustain and those long-term investments, because even modernizing some of our older systems, you can't do that in a year. And even the bigger mainframes, you can't pick apart those in a year. And you have to maintain the old system while you're moving to the new one, and continue to build on that. So I think there's a need for that sustained continuous modernization, and having those multi-year funds to be able to do that and drive change across the federal government. It makes it tough. I lived it as a CIO. I didn't always know year to year what money I had a grand plan, but I'd had to throttle it back or maybe accelerate depending on the funding that was coming in.
Your agency was also one that got to take advantage early on of the working capital funds. Is that something?
We were the first agency that got the IT Working Capital Fund, which is actually really good, because I was able to lay out and say, okay, for the next couple of years, these need to be the focus areas. And it wasn't necessarily just tech things, but it tied to mission and what the mission needed to do, and it tied to the strategic plan, and that way it gave me a 3-year runway. A continual 3-year runway on that spend, so that I can continue to support the mission and bring in the new technology as I needed to support, even as mission requirements changed, but to keep the systems up to date.
Yeah, hopefully that's something Congress can keep working on, and we can get more of those in more agencies.
I know a lot of agencies would like to have those IT working capital funds for the multi-year funding, and that the CIO can really drive those funds, certainly in partnership with the CFO, but having the CIO really drive how those dollars are going to be spent in the agency.
Yeah, just to wrap up on this, because one of the things when I talk to people in Congress, especially like appropriators and the like, one of the big holdups they have is they don't always trust agencies to do to spend the money well, and to do, because of some of the past things that have happened with especially big IT projects. So what can be done to help instill that trust? One, to maybe set up some roadblocks or what you need to do at the agency level, but also get Congress to trust agencies to use those working capital funds well.
It's interesting, because when at SBA as the CIO, when I stood up the IT Working Capital Fund, I had to provide quarterly reports to OMB, right? I had to respond to letters from the Hill, right? Every year I had to say, here's what it's for and here's what I did. And then, not just reporting up to OMB, but I had to meet with my desk officers. I had to get into the details, and here's the money, and if I made any shifts in those dollars. So the oversight was there from OMB. So I'm not sure where, not trusting the CIO when there is actual oversight built in, and then reporting in up to Congress and others. So I'm not sure of that, because I did a lot of reporting.
So more compliance reports is what you're saying now.
Exactly.
Well, Maria, unfortunately, we are well out of time here. So before we close, just want to thank you for joining us today and sharing your work and your journey.
Great. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you again to Tableau for underwriting this conversation series. And stay safe and have a great day, everyone.